of the things that Alex is teaching us into practice with case study examples. So if you can just be prepared for that, you might need to clean a few things off the table, but it'll be a bit before we're properly into using the papers. And we said it at the beginning, but just to say it again, we're so thankful to get to be here. We started talking about this in 2018, and so for this to actually have come to fruition and for us to get to be here today and working through some of these concepts together is actually, it's a really, really special moment, and we don't take it lightly. So thank you for having us. What I'm hoping that we'll get through over the next 2.5 hours, but we want to gauge as we go along, is to do a little bit of an introduction to risk management for roads and linear infrastructure. And then I've got 2 case studies. We may make it through both today, or we may not. We'll see how it goes. But I think it's more important that we have the opportunity to stop and answer questions and also have interactive elements. So similar to Alex, I'll pause at certain moments and we can have questions, but don't be shy, because I think those are where the real richness comes. And then we'll get into the closing. So as we go through this, we're going to be using the risk management framework that Alex presented. But what you're going to see in the case studies is it's not perfect. So that's exactly what Alex said, is that this is something that can help guide actions. And then sometimes, based on what you need for your specific projects, you might have to deviate a little bit. And so we'll see that in one of the case studies, that it doesn't follow this framework exactly, but nevertheless, the framework itself is helpful in framing up what might be the next step that we have to go through, and then when we actually get to the step, we might have to modify it a little bit. So we'll move through the risk management framework. We'll both do this larger one that has the regional and site-specific, and spend some time looking at examples of site-specific risk management. To start us off, is an overall truth here, which is that in mountainous environments, linear infrastructure will cross hazardous terrain. So it's very unlikely that there's going to be a hazard-free option. That means that we then have to think about the other aspects of the risk management that Alex talked about. And this is true. Oh, I thought that I was going to nail this because of Alex showing us how, but we'll work on it. This is true whether you're talking about roads that are connecting very small communities. And it's also true when you have major arterial highways. So what we then have to think about is, if we know that we're going to be crossing hazardous terrain because we're in these mountainous environments, the next thing we have to think about is how to use the resources that are available to us effectively to manage risk. So there's going to be no hazard-free options. We need to use the resources that we have. We're not going to be able to build the brick house everywhere, and we're certainly not going to be able to do it all at once. And so we need to figure out how we're going to use the resources. And as Alex shared, prioritization is a tool that can help us to support decision-making and to guide the investments of those available resources. So this particular map here is the major highways in Nepal, and all of you know far better than I do that over relatively short distances, you can be moving from the Terai all the way to the high Himalayas, experiencing a very wide range of hazards in a highly active area. And then you've also got the east to west. And so when we contextualize everything that Alex talked about, hazardous terrain, not able to mitigate or manage risk everywhere all at once, not able to eliminate risk, we need to have tools that help us to guide our decision-making, and prioritization is one of them. Something I've just realized is that in comparison to Alex, I have a tendency to speak rather quickly. I'm going to try not to do that, but please feel free to stop me at any point to tell me to slow down. And I'll ask Alex and Emily to especially help with that. So apologies, please, to interrupt. Alex talked about 3 approaches to prioritization, acknowledging this is not the full suite. But just as a reminder, highest risk, where you're prioritizing on the locations of highest risk, that's very helpful when you want to know where the highest risk is. 4 things like getting prepared for a disaster, putting together response plans for those locations that are going to be highest risk, and for building awareness and education. When we've got different types of problems, like where we're trying to allocate resources, or we're trying to utilize those resources to maximize how much risk we can reduce, we might use most cost-effective. And if we're looking between different corridors, then we might prioritize by corridor. So I'll ask that you keep these concepts in mind, and throughout the course of this session, I'll be able to share some of the learnings that I've had where we picked the wrong one. We took the wrong approach for the decision, and hopefully by sharing this lesson, you don't do the same, or you do the same less times than we do. Now, beyond prioritization approach, it's really important to think about when you're doing your prioritization, what the hazards are and what the infrastructure that you're considering is. And the reason is that hazards are going to affect infrastructure very differently depending on the type of infrastructure and the type of hazard. So each of these is a type of linear infrastructure. We've got a road, a pipeline, a railway, and they will respond differently to different hazards. So, for example, when you've got a railway and you've got rocks that fall on it, this is for some size, this is a person's leg. A rock of this size is actually a very big problem for a railway. But for a road, a rock of this size, not a big deal at all. You can come by, you can push it off the road, you might even be able to push it off the road by a human being. Not a big problem. If you had infrastructure that was buried underground, even less of a problem. Sorry, it's asking me to keep track of my time. It's a problem with being a consultant. You have to remember where all your time went. Okay, if you contrast that to a debris flow or a debris flood, again, you've got a person for scale, those can erode down and laterally. And so these are a very big problem for roads, railways, pipelines, other things. So this you have to think about differently than, for example, rockfall. Probably all of you. This is also going to be a problem, but an even bigger one. So when we're thinking about prioritizing, we need to think about what's the infrastructure we have and how's the hazard that we're considering likely to affect it. Hopefully that provides a bit of framing to get into the case studies, but our key message is response to different hazards is going to differ, and so you need to be thinking about that as you're setting up your project work. And then really importantly, where this prioritization is an initial step that's going to help future work, you want to make sure that the methods that you use, the data you collect, are going to be helpful to you later. So while you can use a method for prioritization and a different method later, you resources as effectively as possible. It costs money to get every piece of information. So you really have to think about what do I need to make the next decision and endeavor to set up to get that amount of information, but not more. So what Alex is saying, not science for the sake of science. Science for the sake of science, again, wonderful, but when we're trying to work on real-world problems, you want to get the information that you need to make a decision, figure out what more information you need to get to the next step, and plan things along those ways. Because you can, and I have, spend far too long getting information that you think you'll use, but you actually don't. So, a couple of things to keep in mind. Which brings us into our first case study here. Before I do that, are there any quick questions on kind of the high-level framing?
You talked about data collection, right?
Yep.
So what kind of data do we need to collect?
Okay, so the question is, what kind of data do we need to collect? And the answer is going to be informed by your problem statement and your objectives. Meaning, you're not always going to need the same information in the same quantities or at the same level of detail. The key is for yourself working on the project to work through what is my detailed problem statement, what is the decision that's going to be needed to be made, what information would I need to get me there. So, unfortunately, there's no menu, but it also liberates you to design the projects, the data collection, the site investigation work that you do in response to the project that you're working on. Any other questions just on this initial part? Okay. So the case study we're going to hop into here, it's Highway 1. I'll give a bit of background, but just to kind of set the stage, in this particular project, we're going to be looking at prioritizing risk management on an infrastructure corridor that already exists, and we're going to be looking at one hazard type. When we get into the second case study, it's going to be twinning a corridor that exists, so it's going to be adding a corridor and multiple hazard types. So we're going to kind of build the complexity over the course of the session. Okay, so this is Canada. On the far, far east side of Canada is where Keshub lives. Keshub's off for some other meetings now, but on the west side of Canada is where we live. And all across Canada is this red line. It's called the Trans-Canada Highway. So it connects one side of the country all the way to the other side of the country. And it's the main transportation corridor that connects both sides. And then it's not just connecting within Canada, but it's the ability to move goods from one location to another, to the ports, and be able to get them out into international markets. So very, very important for Canada's economy. Okay, we're going to zoom in right close to where Emily and I live here and where Alex does a lot of work. And in that section of Highway 1, so we're in Western Canada, the Trans-Canada Highway is referred to as Highway 1. And we're going to look at one small section that's between a town called Bridal Falls and a town called Hope. This section of Highway 1, is, oh, that is sensitive. Thank you. Okay, that section of highway is kind of squished between mountains and the Fraser River. And on it, there's about 18,000 vehicles per day. 75% of those tend to be personal vehicles, but the other 25 is trucks that are moving goods out to the West Coast that can then be taken to international areas. When this road is closed, an estimate of how much it costs is more than $500,000 Canadian per hour. So that works out to being more than 48 million rupees per hour that it's closed. That's just on the road side. If you start to compound in the cascading impacts of that closure on I'm losing the words here right now, but like the larger economic impacts, it could be 10 times higher or more. And the reason to share this is just to contextualize why it's important to us that this road stays open. The other thing is that if it's closed, there's limited to no alternate routes. You would need to potentially go through, because the border with the United States, another country, is very close. You would potentially have to go through the United States, or you would have to go through roads that are unlikely to be open if this is closed because of the hazards. And in that same corridor, there's this highway, Highway 1. There's a series of pipelines that are very important for moving oil and gas. There is hydro transmission towers, rail line, and fiber optic cables. So there's a lot of other stakeholders, and that becomes important when you think of those competing objectives. You've got many stakeholders who have different perspectives and even more limited space. You're already limited by the mountains and the river, And then there's a bunch of different utilities that are sharing that corridor. Okay, so zooming in, these blobs here, each one of them is an alluvial fan. So there are 49 that are outlined there. And then in between there's larger creeks, like there's Wall-Each Creek, and there is Silver Hope Creek. And so what this is showing is over a relatively short stretch of road, it's subject to hazards from 49 different creeks. And those affect the road on a range from flooding. So this is an example of flooding here. This is a helicopter photo during a major flood event. These are all the same creek. What you see here is LiDAR change detection, which is a tool that we use where you can get a high resolution digital elevation model of topography for 2 time periods and get a difference between them where, sorry, it wants me to track my time again, where the blue is where you have had erosion, red is where you've had deposition, and then this is the satellite imagery. So although there is quite a lot of flooding happening here, very limited impact to the road because there is a bridge here. So very limited impact to the road. If we contrast that with what a debris flow impact looks like, this is the eastbound lane of the road, this is the westbound lane of the road, and there was a major debris flow that came down, deposited material across the road, and it actually impacted a truck. It pushed a truck almost off the road here. And then there's other locations that aren't traditional debris floods or debris flows, but where when you get a significant amount of water running off the slope, you can get deep erosion rapidly that deposits material on the slope similar, or on the road similar to a debris flow. So we've got a range of potential hazards and many, many, many of them, but they're all kind of the same hazard type. And then there's been a history of activity that's affected the road. So we've had from 1951 to 2023, quite a lot of impacts to the road. So remember, this is a road we really want to keep open, and it's also costing the Canadian government and taxpayers lots of money to be managing the risks. The biggest impact recently came in 2021, associated with what we call an atmospheric river. That's not necessarily important for the risk management framework that we're doing here, but it helps to contextualize the hazards in this particular area. Where an atmospheric river is exactly what it sounds like. It's as though there's a river of moisture coming through the atmosphere. When it hits the west coast of Canada and runs into mountains, then that moisture drops out and you can get months or multiple months worth of rain over a series of hours to days. And in 2021, this led to really widespread flooding and debris flows. So we were asked to help the government make a decision around what to do about this. So if we bring our risk management framework back, we'll start at our first step to define the problem and objectives. And so the ask was, how should we reduce debris flow risk in the corridor? And I'd like to begin our interactive parts now. So as a group, your tables can be groups. Some of the tables have a few more folks, so feel free to move around. But just in your group, I'd like for you to talk for maybe 2 minutes about what would be your first step to reduce debris flow risk. So as you're doing this, think about the risk management framework, think about some of Alex's key messages, and then I'll ask a couple tables to report back. So 2 minutes, chat amongst yourselves, and then I'll hear what ideas come up.
That's like to design. But just generally, what are the general ideas that you go?
I think there's a mic at your table. Okay, you're welcome. Okay, great.
Is Mr. Alex explain all here?
Or vulnerability or exposure. So I think in this case hazard is already identified. So our step will be either to reduce the vulnerability or to reduce the exposure. So I think as you have mentioned the first step to reduce the debris flow risk. I think in design, while designing the linear infrastructure, we can design it in such a way that we can reduce the exposure to that infrastructure. So I think we can find the alternate routes for that infrastructure.
Okay.
The first step.
Already in place, we cannot reduce exposure at all because it's like the prominent highway in Canada. So either we can reduce the hazard or the vulnerability. As he mentioned, we have already identified hazards, so I think we need to reduce the vulnerability. So that's what we test.
Okay, that's great. But I was hoping you might start with was to acknowledge this is not a problem statement that is detailed enough to start with. So I very much appreciate the excitement to jump in, to thinking about the mitigation strategies, to compare and contrast them. And that is what most of us do. We immediately start thinking about how are we going to solve the problem. So this was a little bit of a trick question. I apologize for making the first one a bit of a tricky one. But what I wanted to point out was that this is what I do too. This is what we all want to do. We have a problem. We want to come up with a solution and come up with it fast, you know? But I really do encourage you to pause and take the time for that detailed problem statement. So we've got a little bit of a started one there, but I'm going to elaborate on it further. So our problem, we've got steep creek hazards. They interrupt the safe flow of personal, recreational, and commercial traffic. They introduce costs for the Transportation Authority. That's called the Ministry of Transportation where I live. You'll hear me say that again, or MOTI. If I say MOTI, it's just a fast way of saying Ministry of Transportation. That brings costs to taxpayers to clean things up and repair infrastructure when these debris flows, or floods happen. Our mitigation options here are limited by the fact that there's just not enough funding to mitigate every single one of these sites all at once, nor would that be a good use of money. Western Canada, kind of like Nepal, is filled with mountains and rivers, and so we can't spend all of the money on just this little section of highway. We've also got, our mitigation options are limited by space. You've got limited space and you've got multiple stakeholders' rights of way within the corridor. Okay, so that helps us. I frame this a bit differently than Alex does, but we've got a range of problems here that we've got to think about. And then the other half of that that's really, really important is what do we hope? At the end of this, what would we hope? So here, we really hope to keep the traffic lanes open. And that, we can say at a minimum, a single lane of traffic. And that's because when the road is closed, there's such significant impacts on people who use the road and in terms of costs. We want those that are using the road to be able to do so safely. We want to reduce repair and cleanup costs. And ideally, because we don't have unlimited funds, we want to use those funds to maximize overall risk reduction for investment. So as we go through this, I'm hoping that you'll see, at least the experience that I have was having this clearly outlined. And I will admit, I did not start with having them clearly outlined at the beginning. I stumbled through, realized, oh, I've missed the problem a little bit here and had to come back and clarify. But I'm hoping that we can demonstrate why having this outlined at the beginning is so important to the successful completion of the project. Okay, so we have defined the problem and the objectives. The next question we had is, are priority sites already identified. Now, we were exceptionally lucky in this case because a few years prior, there had been a study in this corridor. It was actually a study completed by BGC, our group, and they had ranked each of the creeks by public safety and economic risk. So we're a step ahead. We've got our problem, we've got our objectives, the priority sites are there, wonderful, off to the races. Do you say that? We'll say off to the races, meaning like, we can start. I don't know if that's said here. So this is what they did. They looked at every creek. They did a spectacular job of characterizing the hazards, looking at what was happening in the watershed, what was happening in the fans, and they put together these matrices. So similar to what Alex showed, you've got they call it overall geohazard rating. That's an expression of how likely the hazard is. And in this case, public safety, how severe is the consequence? So if you have a hazard that's high likelihood and high consequence, it gets listed as high. And then they tabulated that up, so they went along the highway, broke it into segments, and those were characterized by safety and economic priority ratings. So this chart here shows you how many segments of the highway fell into very low public safety, low, moderate, high. They did the same for economic. And then they did this along maps. And this is, a really powerful visualization tool. You can see along the highway where here the colors, it's probably too small for you to see, but they correspond with public safety risk. So you can see quickly, right here in red, high public safety risk. So what they did was a highest risk prioritization. And when we started this project, I thought, wonderful, someone has prioritized the sites for us. And then we started asking the question. They'd identified that there were 6 creeks that were both high public safety and high economic risk. So we asked the question, if we mitigated those 6 creeks, if we picked those, would we achieve our objectives? So let's see. Would it reduce safety risks for road users and maintenance workers? At the creeks were they mitigated? Absolutely. Would it reduce repair costs and cleanup costs? At the creeks that were mitigated? Again, absolutely. Would it keep the traffic lanes open? That was a question mark. We weren't sure if that would keep the traffic lanes open. It would keep them open in those sections, but remember what Alex talked about, that if any part of your road is cut off, your road is cut off. And then the big question was, would it maximize the overall risk reduction for the investment? And this comes back to the point that I was sharing at the beginning, which was, when you're doing your prioritization study, you should design it to inform the next step. So in the next step, we would need to start putting together mitigation designs, looking at how much they cost, and thinking about how much risk they would reduce. The big challenge that we ran into was when they did the matrix-based prioritization, it actually didn't help us to evaluate how cost-effective it would be to reduce those creeks, risk at those creeks. So, what we learned, and this was a huge lesson for me, and I hope that you'll take it away, is that you really need to select the type of prioritization you do for the decision that needs to be made. So what they did provides a lot of value. It helped MOTI be able to know where the areas of highest risk were. It can help them to put together response plans. But when we were asked the question to help them to inform where should they prioritize and allocate resources, we actually needed a different approach. So, with input from MOTI, what we decided to do was to pursue a different approach that would help us to maximize the risk reduction over a 75-year service life. So this is bringing in another thing Alex talked about, that we need to think not only about the 2-year cost to construct things, but what are the next 75 years going to look like? And to do that, again, we wanted to know about cost effectiveness. We needed to have a baseline estimate of risk that we could then compare with the cost to mitigate. So we needed it to be in a term that you could compare. And we needed to be able to compare it between sites too. So it's not just the before and after, but before and after, and is one site better than another? You don't have to read all these words. But we're still at this step, our priority sites identified, and what we realized was we actually weren't going to be able to just take the creeks that were identified in the previous work, but we needed to bring in a few more criteria. Those are listed here. It's not important to read them, excepting to make the point that the criteria that help you to select your priority sites are going to look different depending on the project, and it's up to you to define those criteria referring back to your problems and your objectives. Okay, so we've done our first step. We've defined the problem and objectives. We've got our priority sites now. Now we're going to step into the regional prioritization. So what we did is for each of the priority creeks, we estimated risk associated with 4 consequence types. Now, thinking of earlier today, Alex acknowledged that you can have direct consequences, indirect consequences, and intangible consequences. For the purposes of this work, the types of consequences that MOTI was worried about was how much does it cost them? Like when they have to go out, if they have to clean debris off the road, and if they have to repair culverts, how much does it cost them? They care about harm to the public, people being able to safely use the road. They cared about the cost to the traveling public and the economy associated with road closures. And then we brought in an indirect measure that I'll speak about that acknowledges that we're not capturing all of the risk in these measures. So to say a bit more about each of these and why they were important, the owner costs that we described, those are direct costs, where Alex was referring to direct consequences. This is the direct cost of having to move material off the road. For scale, there's an excavator here and here, so it's a lot of material to move off the road. And then after, they might have to fix bridges, clean out basins, repair culverts. So that falls into kind of the infrastructure and owner costs. The next cost that we looked at, the direct consequence could be a fatality, but we were using an indirect measure of that. And we'll talk about this quite a bit more, but we were using an indirect measure that you can use willingness to pay. We'll talk about this a bit more, but what it does is it can take an estimate of how likely you're to see a fatality, a probability of a fatality, and turn that into an annual risk of fatality using a number. The willingness to pay, it's used a lot in health, where they're trying to evaluate the cost effectiveness of different interventions or types of treatment. And so it's a helpful tool here. And the reason why it was very important here was we needed to get into an economic measure for the type of comparison that we were doing. The cost to the traveling public, that's associated with road closures and detours, and it's the vehicle operating costs and lost wages that happen when the road's closed or when there's a long detour. And the last one was indirect. So this is acknowledging that when there's an emergency, it costs a bunch of resources to get emergency managers organized, to get workers out to be, setting up pylons and closing the roads and doing other things. So this was a bit of an additional add to acknowledge that additional cost. Okay, so we had all of those 4. But to be able to compare them, they're very different, right? Like each of those is potentially a different type of consequence. To compare them to one another, we needed to turn them into a consistent metric. So we used dollars for each of these, and that helps us to be able to compare kind of apples to apples, we would say in English, not apples to oranges. You're nodding your head? Yes, good? Okay. Okay, so this was our second lesson here, which is that the methodology that you use to assess risk should be designed to support the decisions and objectives that you have. In this case, we were selecting consequences types that would help inform decisions around debris flow mitigation. And to be able to compare them, we needed to turn them into a consistent metric that we could compare between sites and before and after mitigation. Okay, I will pause there before getting a little bit mathy for a bit. Is there any questions on that component? Okay, we'll move into, so it's going to be a bit mathy, but this is going to answer the question I think you asked earlier about how do you actually bring these pieces together. So you've got hazard, exposure, vulnerability. How do we bring them together? This is going to be one example. Again, it's not the only example, but hoping to walk through it to demonstrate how we used it on this project. When we get through the risk equation, we'll get back into doing some interactive activities together. Okay, so this should look familiar. I think I flipped the terms from what Alex showed earlier, but you've got risk, probability times consequences, and then you've got the sum of, because you're summing all the scenarios that you're considering. Here, for this particular project, the probability that we were looking at was how likely is it that a debris flow or a debris flood reaches the road. Then, on the consequence side, we're saying, if the debris flow reaches the road, how likely is it that it results in some form of loss with the loss measures that we were looking at? So, for the next bit, instead of the traditional equation, the equation will look like this. It's the sum of all the scenarios where you have a debris flow or a debris flood that reaches the road and results in some form of loss. And how we actually get there is by this risk equation. So Alex is showing this in an event tree, but you've got a number of terms and they multiply together. So the first term is the hazard probability. This is how likely is it that a hazard happens or not. So you have to evaluate, in this case, a debris flood or debris flow. What is the probability that that occurs in a time interval that you're interested in about? Usually we'll do this annually because it's an increment of time that's helpful for us to look at. Then, and you're going to see probability a lot here because these are not certainties. Every part of this is a bit uncertain. So we're looking at, again, the probability. This time it's the spatial impact. So we've got a debris flow or a debris flood that initiates. How likely is it to spatially, so get to a space where an element at risk exists? Then we ask the question around what we call temporal probability. If the hazard starts, reaches the place, how likely is it that your element at risk is there when the hazard happens? Exposure, yes, very good. It's a measure of the value or number of elements at risk. So this could be in lives, it could be in dollars, it could be in Nepali rupee. And the last piece is the vulnerability. So that is how likely is your element at risk. Alex talked a lot about houses. How likely is it that your house is going to experience loss? Now, if we bring back what we're trying to do in this particular project, this equation, the lower one, the risk equation, that's very transferable across a lot of projects. This one up here is specific. So we're specifically thinking about debris flows reaching the road and resulting in some form of loss. So I think the color coding is maybe kind of hard to see, but this text is in green. And the reason is just to show that in this case that the likelihood that the debris flow reaches the road relates to these two first terms. So your hazard happens, reaches the road. And the way that we did this in this case is we used a combination of numerical models and what we had observed historically from events. So I'm not going to get into the details of the modeling, but what we did was for each of the creeks, we ran a model and we looked at 4 return periods. Those return periods are just a proxy for event size. So we looked at 4 sizes of events on each of the creeks, and then we also looked at what we'd seen in the past. So in this here, each of the different colors show how far the models show the debris flow will reach in each event, and the black dashed outline was what was observed in 2021. Now, this is for a small section of road, and it was possible to do numerical modeling there within the budget we had available to us. If you were working over a much wider area, it wouldn't be possible or practical to do it at this level of detail. You would need to design it differently for the type of decision you were making. So just to show a quick example of what that could look like, again, you'll design it to the specific problem. This was a very similar project, but it was applied across an entire state, so much, much larger than Nepal, actually. And what they did was they did observations of the watershed, observations in the fan, and they correlated those to indices. So Alex described a risk index. They used a risk index approach. And this, for them, was enough detail for the scale of the study that they were doing, and it was repeatable and consistent. So they set up consistent criteria for what those ratings should be. You can apply it consistently. And importantly, when you do this, because this was happening over a very wide area, it was probably being done by more than one person, you need to have very clear criteria, and your categories need to be different enough so that if I'm establishing the ratings and Alex is establishing the ratings, we're really confident we're gonna land in the same category because the category is big enough. It's bigger than the range of our uncertainty. So you don't want to end up with categories that are so small you can't consistently check if you're in the same one. Okay, we've talked about the likelihood of the debris flow reaching the road. The next part to talk about in this project is that it results in loss. The loss measures, again, are the likelihood that the element at risk is there, how many or how much are they valued, and how vulnerable they are. Now, the reason to walk through this in detail is it adds a bit to what Alex was describing this morning. So when you're thinking about your hazard, your exposure, your vulnerability, this adds even a little bit of another layer to think about which of these terms. Alex talked about breaking the chain. Where can we break the chain or make the chain smaller because they're multiplied together? Okay, so again, we used our numerical modeling for the beginning of our likelihood. And then remember we have those 4 consequence types. So we need to figure out how is it that we're going to apply this equation, to those 4 consequence types. It's poor. Okay, so on the temporal probability side, so this is the element there at the time the hazard happens? Super easy to answer for things that don't move. So the road doesn't move, the road's always going to be there. A detour, so these vehicles move, but whether or not there's a detour, it either is happening or it's not. So it's a temporal probability of 1. And same thing with indirect costs. It's either happening or not. But people move. People in cars move. So that one was a little bit more complicated. That's where you have to assign somewhere between 0 and 1. And that's going to take into account the size of the hazard area, how many cars are coming through, and how fast they're moving. So won't get into the details of how to calculate that, but very happy to chat about it afterwards. The next thing we had to think about was what's exposed and what's the value of it. So for the MOTI cost, the owner cost, we used unit rates. So we said, it costs however many dollars per truckload to get material away, and it costs however many dollars to replace a culvert. And that helped us to get a measure on the road costs. For the people, again, we were turning it into that economic value. So we used the willingness to pay times how many people on average would be in a car. The detour cost was how many vehicles times the costs. And then the indirect cost was just a percent of the total damages. And then the last thing is how vulnerable are they? So this is a little bit different than straw house, wood house, brick house. We used kind of percent damage for the road. For life loss, it was between 0 and 1. Detour costs, as we said, are either happening or not. And then indirect costs, again, is just it's either happening or not. So walking through all of that in detail, again, you don't have to read this. You'll see it afterward if you wanted to see how we broke it down. But all of this is just to kind of iterate the importance of breaking down your problem. So in this case, it was like we are trying to manage debris flow risk. We've got to understand what's driving the risk, and this allowed us a way of systematically going through. And what you'll see in the next bit is that helps us to figure out, what's causing the highest amount of the risk. Is most of the risk coming from safety costs? Is most of the risk coming from the cost of infrastructure? Because that will help you to know where can I spend my money most effectively. I've gone through these already, so I'm going to move by them quickly just to avoid repetition here. Oops. And show where we got to. So where we got, this is for a single creek. We put together plots like this, and there's lots of things that are on these plots, and I'll kind of talk through how they were useful to us. But just to show what's on them, on the y-axis here is annualized economic risk. So that's changing the dollar amounts into what it costs every year, and that makes it easier to compare in between. So that's just a means to compare things so that you've got a consistent term. The next thing we looked at was eastbound versus westbound lane. So you can see here that the eastbound lane gets hit first, and for the larger events, both lanes get hit. And then we've got the event sizes, so smaller event up to larger event. Whoops. What you'll see though is when you're looking at the annualized risk, what pops out is that those events that happen more frequently are actually resulting in more risk. So when we come back to the question that we had earlier of, should we always build the brick house? If we think of the brick house as mitigating the largest event, what this suggests to us is maybe not. Maybe by mitigating the smaller events, you're actually reducing the risk by quite a lot. And then the last thing is the cost types along the bottom. So just because it might be hard to see, purple is costs associated with road closures and detours. Yellow is safety cost. Blue is owner cost. And orange is indirect. So what might be popping out immediately is not only is it the more frequent events that are resulting in more risk, but the purple, the cost of the road closure, is really driving the risk. So this is on one creek. Compiling that down, each one of these bars, each one of these columns is a creek. And what pops out to me immediately is that the purple, the cost associated with road closure, is the biggest section of the bars. In fact, it's accounting for 70% of the baseline risk. We can do the same thing by looking at return periods. So again, every one of these is a creek with all of the costs added up. This is quite small, but blue is the 10 to 30 year event, orange is the 30 to 100, gray is 100 to 300, and yellow is 300 to 1,000. And each of those are a proxy for size, but what we can see here is that the two most frequent events, and I apologize, I put these in the order of highest to lowest, but it's kind of confusing. The main thing is the two most frequent events are driving most of the baseline risk. So they're driving 67% of the baseline risk. So what I would like to do now is get back together in our groups, and we'll spend a bit longer this time, but what I'd like for you to talk about in your groups is, armed with an understanding of the baseline risk, how can you use that information to help to think about our mitigation strategies? And two questions that you can think about is there a cost type to prioritize trying to reduce? And how would a corridor approach differ from a site-specific approach? So let's say we'll come back together again in about 6 minutes and hear from some tables. I'm going to ask that we hear from different tables than we heard from last time, so the quieter tables, get ready. We're going to try and call on you. And we can ask Alex and Emily to split up between tables again, and I'll pull us back in about 6 minutes' time. Sure. But before mitigation, we've added no mitigation yet. We're just getting a snapshot of what is now.
What's the question? Is there a question here?
Yeah.
Life safety.
Yes. Just to start to think that's good. Sorry to be tricky. But all of these things have
discussion of this. We have concluded that first of all, for the cost type, we consider that travel cost and safety cost is prime thing, and for the second question, we have gone for the corridor approach because as Alex stated earlier, if we go for the site-specific way, then if one link from the same gets disabled, then entire corridor won't work. So we stick with the corridor approach.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think if I understand this, from having the road closed and from safety, and if possible, you would try and focus on reducing risk all through the corridor instead of at individual sites. Okay? Maybe you could pass it, I think we heard.
Understand which particular segment of corridor is prone to high risk, and particular underlying cause of risk is most responsible by indirect cost, which is general public transportation, and utilizing resources based upon our points, applying them in particular segment for particular factor.
So you're saying that of the risks and what is leading to the most risk, helps you to make an informed decision, but it doesn't necessarily give you an answer. You have to keep coming back to that very first step of what is the problem or problems that we're trying to solve, and what are our objectives. So yeah, acknowledging that one was tricky, not on purpose. None of the future ones are purposefully tricky, it was only the first one. So this was a big lesson for me here actually, because most of the work that I do is actually focused within communities and looking at life safety. So I have a bias to think about life safety first, and going through this exercise and figuring out, oh my goodness, the thing that's really leading to the most risk is having the road closed. That was very eye-opening to realize, wow, I have to maybe think about that a bit more as we start to develop ideas around mitigation. The other thing is you may not have this here, but oftentimes what we see in Western Canada, where most of my work is a desire to mitigate very large events. So to focus, if you're going to invest in mitigation in some locations, to mitigate to the largest event that maybe has the highest potential consequences. But because it's so rare, might not actually be leading to risk. We're going to hear some examples over the next couple of days where it's the opposite, where you find out that it actually is the big events that are leading to risk. And understanding that kind of helps you realize what event size, how big of an event do I need to worry about here, or how big of an event, if I mitigate it, will lead to the most risk reduction. And again, the reason to go through this equation and to familiarize yourself is it just helps you to do that. It helps you to break the problem down into little pieces and to understand what's driving risk. Okay, so this is where I said that we would break away from the framework a little bit, and this is where we have to. So we actually have to do two things at once here. So we have to think about our regional, we did the baseline prioritization, but when we're thinking about how do we reduce risk in the corridor, we have to think site-specific, where risk reduction happens, but then we have to compare those to one another. So we're doing site-specific and regional. And the reason to share that is, that's okay. The framework is not going to be linear or perfect every time, but it helps you to organize your thinking. So, what we did next was we did a range of conceptual mitigation options. Now, that word conceptual is very important to us. It means we did enough to say, what's possible here? We didn't go all the way to doing the design, all of the effort of getting our material quantities perfect and the footprints and doing site investigation, because that would be more information than we need at this point. So we just came up with concepts. Future work will carry those concepts forward, but only on the sites that get prioritized. And we used what Alex had. So we thought about hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So we thought about what concepts could we apply to reduce hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and we did it at every creek. To give you an idea of what some of these concepts look like, these are simple things that can be constructed relatively easily. One is a deflection run. So if the debris flow or debris flow would previously come straight through here, you can build a berm that will direct the debris flow away from what you're concerned about. That could be a road, you could direct it away, or it could be a house where you're directing it away from a house. The next thing was all of these creeks eventually have to go under the road here. So you can add these debris racks, and what they look like is almost like big combs. And the idea is that they hold up the rocks and sediment so that hopefully they don't make it into the culvert or the bridge. Okay? And then we also looked at basins. So this is where you can do it two ways. You can dig down to make an area that the sediment will deposit, or you can build up so that there's an area that the sediment will deposit. So that's not all the concepts that we looked at, but that's kind of the level of details. We just were looking at what would be possible to reduce risk at each site. In this case, everything that we looked at focused on constructed works. And the reason was we were trying to focus on minimizing road closure. So something like an early warning system or a weather forecast-based system where we say, sorry, I think this is coming in now, where we say it looks like in the next few days we're going to have enough rain that maybe we'll see floods, or debris flows, so we're going to close the road. That is one way that you can manage the exposure, at least to people on the road. But what that would also do is all of these costs of having the road closed, you would be adding those. And we always have to be a bit careful when we have those, right? So we're a bit conservative. You're always going to close the road more often than the debris flows or debris floods happen. So you would actually not only be having this risk, you'd be making it higher because you would close the road even more often than they would happen naturally. So that doesn't mean it's an option that shouldn't be on the table or couldn't be on the table, but for this particular project, we focused on things that you could construct. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lay the stage for one creek, and then we're going to go through the site-specific design framework at your tables. So here we have an example. We have a creek coming down, it's the blue line. We've got the road in gray. So we've got the eastbound lane and the westbound lane. The fan is here. And these are some photographs. They're a bit hard to see because they're taken from a helicopter in the middle of a rainstorm. But these are some of what happened in 2021 on this creek. You can see this is the eastbound lane is down here. This is a different right-of-way. There's sediment, there's flooding, it got onto the road, it got between, and it got onto both lanes. It's the same creek here, just from a different angle. Now, this looks like quite a mess, but what you'll see is when you run the numerical models, it looks like most of the flow is going to go this way. So all of the blue kind of shows it goes this way. But what you'll also see is this dashed line goes a different direction. The dashed line is what actually happened in 2021. So there's an important lesson here, which is that we say in Canada, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This model is wrong. The reason the model is wrong is because the model treats the ground as though it can't change. But the reason why some of the flooding you'll see goes around these curves is there's an old logging road, and so it eroded off the side, and then the debris flow went that way. So our model results can't show us that because it doesn't take it into account. It's important to remember, models aren't always going to be right, they can be useful. So what we're going to do now is we'll do this step by step, and I think we'll do this, we're doing until what, 5:45? Okay, so what I would propose is that we work through this for most of that time, and we'll do it at the tables on their pieces of paper, and we'll just work through it one step at a time. So what the first step will be is your choice. If you like to draw art, you could draw your own hazard, vulnerability, exposure, Venn diagram on your piece of paper, or you could just write them in columns. What I would like you to do is to think about what are the hazards? And write those down. What's exposed to those hazards? Write it down. And how vulnerable are those? And then we'll come back and we'll work through it, and then we'll start to build to the next step to identify risk reduction options, think about how we can make a decision of which ones we want to do, and then move into detailed design. So for the beginning, on your pieces of paper, just please as a group, write down what are the hazards, what's exposed, and what's vulnerable. And after a couple of minutes, we'll come back up and we'll write them down here together.
It's okay. If we can.
Yeah, we can put this one. We can put this over here. Only this first one.
ठुलै भएको होला नि तिमीले यहाँ बाजुमा ठुलै भएको
Maybe a different vulnerability. Yeah, because each of these is great. And then for each of those, that's going to mean a different vulnerability potentially.
The debris flow and flooding.
Okay, debris flow and flooding, great. So we've got
These two are the most relevant for that particular site.
Mhm.
And for the exposure, we have divided into two parts: infrastructures and people and vehicle. For infrastructure, road is the obvious one, and there was I believe that particular corridor also catered for other infrastructures like critical services like the gas line and all. So we feel that also falls under the infrastructure.
You can tell if there's anything to add, we can add it.
So maybe like in hazard, they're like landslide because
Okay.
the soil is saturated, and at the same time there's some sedimentation as well.
Okay.
The debris has brought all the sediments and deposited, so that is also one of the hazards. So if you're talking about exposure, I think the major exposure is on in the infrastructures, and at the same time the supply chain as well, like the pipelines, the fiber optics, and everything in between. And like if there's like I don't know if there's settlement or not in Highway 1, but if there is any settlement, like motels and hotels in between the highway, so those kind of settlements is also kind of affected. So I think so exposure like in economy as well, economy at the highway. So like
Okay,
if
I'll
we
leave that
have
under supply chain, and I have to thank you because for the last like 2.5 hours, or since I started this presentation, I've been trying to think of the word supply chain, and I've not been able to. So thank you very much for saying it. There are no settlements, if that helps.
vulnerability, then there's highway damage, loss of life. I think in this case, exposure and vulnerability is kind of the same points. So yeah, we can clearly state them.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you.
As a triggering condition for a debris flow. So I did not landslides here as something separate, but these are here. And then the sedimentation that you were referring to, yeah, we would see those associated. So I think they're encapsulated there. In terms of exposure, yeah, we were worried about the highway and associated infrastructure, people and vehicles, and then acknowledging that there's other infrastructure exposed. It's not the responsibility on this project to manage risk to the other infrastructure, but important to acknowledge that. And then on the vulnerability side, we were concerned, this is quite difficult to read, I think, in the colors, but we were worried about infrastructure damage, we were worried about road closure and detour costs, injury or fatality to those using the road, and indirect economic losses. So those are the 4 categories of costs that we were talking about before. What I would like for you to do now is take your second piece of paper And you can flex your drawing skills again if you want to do your circles, the Venn diagram, or you can do it in lists. But what I would like for you to think about now, where Alex shared this morning, risk is about hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. We reduce risk by reducing one or more of hazard, exposure, or vulnerability. So what I would like you to do this time, instead of writing down what the hazards are, I'd like for you to write down ideas on how to reduce the hazard, ideas on how to reduce exposure, ideas on how to reduce vulnerability. Importantly for this step before you start, they don't need to be the ideas you recommend, because our next step is going to be to use decision tools to think about which ones we want to do. Right now, I just want you to think about what's possible. What ideas do you have? So we'll let you go back in your groups and we'll come back together in a few minutes' time and hear from some other tables around your ideas to reduce hazard, exposure, or vulnerability.
Exposure. We need to understand vulnerability for each hazard exposure. So it's like especially when you're looking at exposure, you actually
Hazard reduction.
Okay?
So some of the things that we discussed was, one of the thing was it was retaining walls, drainage pipes, debris racks, and cascade. Hello? So that we would how would you say, like reduce the debris flow from reaching the infrastructure. So we will be using it. Along with it, we along with it, we can also reinforce the swales with stone pitching or any other different methods, so that the water cannot sweep away the debris. That is we discussed so for hazard reduction.
That's fantastic. Can I ask that you pass the mic to another table to speak to?
Regarding exposure reduction, we can make tunnels. We can add up precaution signs for vehicles and people.
Yeah?
We can have rockfall shelter. We can do settlement relocation.
That would be an excellent idea if there were settlements. So here there's no settlements, but that's an excellent idea in the case that there are settlements. Can you share the third one? I missed that one.
Tunnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, if you could pass the mic to another table. I think the
Vulnerability, I would like to suggest early warning system.
early warning system, okay, yeah.
Risk insurance.
Risk insurance, okay.
And next is capacity building for rescue and relief operations.
Capacity building for rescue operations, okay.
Relief operations.
And what's the last one?
Relief operations.
Okay. Yeah, some of those are more so after, like rescue operations are after. What can you do after the events? Okay, very good. So, again, with all of these things,
reduction or not, the vehicles might be vulnerable to the rock falls. The rock falls might damage the vehicle. Also, it may cause injury to people.
Yeah.
So, one method of reducing vulnerability can be making the vehicles more stronger or resilient to the rock falls.
yeah. No, this is perfect because we said that at this point you don't have to decide if it is the idea you want to pursue or not, but it is an idea.
Can't start making the resilient vehicles.
Yeah.
Less vulnerable vehicles.
Yeah. Now I expect once you get into your what could you do to move the debris under the road? So not into specifics necessarily, but kind of main categories. On the exposure side, we talked about could you reroute the road? Could you divert flows away from the road? And proactive road closure. And then on vulnerability, we talked about adding the debris racks upstream of culverts to reduce blockage potential. So once you've got some ideas, and mind you, these are categories, the next steps is to start to use decision tools to optimize. And the first tool that you can use is to just cross off those that for whatever reason, whether it's technical, cost, wouldn't be socially acceptable, aren't going to be options. So in this case, we crossed off a few. The first is stabilizing the watershed. Alex gave many examples of where there was watershed stabilization works in Japan. We've seen quite a few examples. In Western Canada, that's very rarely an option that we're going to be able to do because it's very expensive and it's also far away. So it's a little bit almost out of sight, out of mind. And if your mitigation requires regular maintenance, it's actually advantageous to have it close enough that the people who are going to be responsible for maintenance can easily check, oh, maintenance needs to happen. When it's farther away up in the watershed, that might compromise whether the maintenance happens. But mainly it's a cost-effective thing. It's not done very much in Western Canada. Rerouting the road, we didn't look at that because that would be enormously expensive and there's limited options to be able to reroute the road. If you were to try and reroute the road to the other side of the river, for example, you have the same suite of hazards just on the other side of the river. Similarly, diverting flows away from the road, that's excellent when there's a spot that you can divert flows to. In our case, because the road is continuous, if you divert the flows, they're going to need to cross the road at some point. So you're kind of moving the problem, but you're not solving the problem. And then, although proactive road closure is an option, and may be an option that's pursued on a temporary basis, because we really want to keep the road open to the extent possible, we took that one off. So then, okay, we've got 3 categories that are worth pursuing further. We've taken the ones that are not options away. Now we need to think about how are we going to evaluate between these? Retaining the debris upslope of the road, increasing the capacity below the road, and adding debris racks to reduce the vulnerability of culverts. And this is where Alex talked about the multi-criteria decision analysis. So it's just a little schematic here, but it's showing that when you're trying to make a decision, you have to think about what's going to be important for your decision. Money is going to be important. Impacts to people can be important. If it's technically feasible, the environmental impacts. And not all of those are going to need to be evaluated every time, but you need to come up with a way to compare the options that you're looking at in a way to inform the decision. So, when we were doing that, the first key concept, this is pulling back to the same concepts that Alex had earlier, is we needed to look at both the capital cost, so the cost to construct, and how much O&M it would be over 75 years. Now, to do those things together, and to be able to evaluate, we would look at benefit-cost ratio, so how much risk reduction, that's your benefit, do you achieve? And how much does it cost you to achieve that risk reduction? And then we looked at the second cost. This is life cycle cost, which is telling you, once you have constructed the mitigation, how much did it cost you? But also how much risk remains. Recognizing that it's very rare that you're going to eliminate risk entirely, how much risk will be remaining afterwards? And what you'll see in these terms is that they're preceded by this word present value a bunch of times. So present value is a really powerful concept when you're starting to think about money over time. So when you're really trying to think about how much does it cost to construct something and then operate and maintain it, you need a way of turning all of those dollars into a single value that can help you to compare. So present value, it's a kind of confusing concept, but it turns it into a very simple and powerful tool. It's how much does money in the future cost now? I'm not going to get into the detailed economics parts of that, but what I am going to share is that if you imagine that we're looking at 75 years and you spend some money every year for 75 years, or maybe you spend some money every 5 years, so 5, 10, 15, to be able to turn those back all into a single value is what present value does. It's a very actually simple thing to do in Excel. I'm happy to chat through with it afterwards, but I'm just acknowledging that this is a tool that you can use to look at how much is something going to cost over an extended period of time in a single value. So we do that for each of the bits. So we can talk about the present value of how much your mitigation cost. That's your capital cost, just one value, and then your operations and maintenance. So Alex talked about the importance of thinking about your operations and maintenance. Are you going to have to come back every year and do something? Do you expect to come back every 10 years or 30 years? And what you do is, if you imagine each of these in Excel, you think, okay, I think we're going to need to clean this basin out every 30 years. You would add that in, and it gives you back a present value. You can also do that for your risk. So if you can turn your risk into an annual number, which is what we were showing before, and then you say every year that's how much it would cost. It doesn't in reality, because hazards don't occur neatly every year, but it's just a comparison tool. Then you can get the present value of risk over a period of time. And then you can look at how much risk reduction do you achieve. That's just taking how much risk is there before mitigation, how much risk is there after mitigation, and the difference is how much risk you've reduced. And what you want to do here is you want to have the highest benefit cost ratio and the lowest life cycle cost in what we're doing. So this was a key lesson that we took away. Alex shared it this morning, hoping that it getting reiterated helps here, but you really want to think about costs over a period of time. And that period of time might be 50 years, it might be 75 years, it might be 100 years, but you really want to think about what are things going to cost you over that time period. So what we did, and I realize this is too small, but the thing that I want to just come back to is on the creek that we were showing the example. Our suggestion was that you would construct a debris basin. Then the question is, how big? How big should the basin be? In some cases, it's going to depend entirely on how much space. So in some cases, you will build the basin based on the available space. But if you have the option, and you start asking the question, should I build it to be 100,000 cubic meters versus 50,000 cubic meters? We did a bit of a comparison. And so what we did was we looked at different basin sizes. That's what's here. They're relatively similar, but they're based on the hazards that we looked at. So remember, Alex talked about hazards have 3 parts. Does anyone remember the 3 parts of the hazard Alex shared this morning? Likelihood, intensity? Process type, right? Likelihood, and process type. Wonderful. So here, we're thinking about the size of the hazards that we were looking at. Then we worked through how much does it cost, how much risk can you reduce, how much is left, what does it cost over the life cycle. All of these little numbers aren't important. The point is that you can use these types of cost-benefit analysis to help you decide how much should we spend, what size should we have at a particular location. Then, again, relatively small here, but we brought in 2 additional qualitative criteria. What you bring into your projects might depend on what you're looking at. But what we said was just qualitatively, but with a description of what that means. How feasible do we think it would be to construct this? And how confident are we in the performance? So the confidence in the performance, where that comes in is, we had descriptions like for low, There's low certainty. Like, we've not done enough to feel confident that we know how this is going to behave, that it'll function in the next storm, or that the performance is expected to be compromised in the next storm. So the purpose of having this here is just to acknowledge that for the decision that you're making or you're helping your projects to make, you can set up additional criteria and you can make definitions for those that help you to assign and then make a decision. So in this case, that's what it looked like in the baseline. What we proposed was to put in a basin and then to construct an engineered channel and actually put in a new culvert. So remember how we said that the creek used to go this way? In this case, there was a lot of space and we were able to think about directing it to another location. Again, this is conceptual. So all of this is just done at a conceptual level and more design work would be needed. But this helps us to think, is this a good spot to spend money? So when we had done that for each of the creeks, we needed to look at how do they compare to one another? Where should we spend the money? What I'm going to show again is criteria that are not important for you to know the criteria, but just to acknowledge that when you're making a decision, being able to lay out the criteria that you use to make the decision is really, really important so that you can make sure that it's clear and that you can demonstrate what the thinking was and it's repeatable. So in this case, we broke the mitigation investments. We said if creeks are assigned level 1, you should mitigate those first. Level 2 would be next. Level 3 would be the ones that you would do last. And we had criteria there that were related to how much baseline economic risk was, if we thought the feasibility and performance would be high or low. But none of this is something you have to take away. The thing to take away is to make sure that you're clearly documenting how do we make the decision so that future people can know, and then it also helps you to clarify your thinking. So the lesson here is to document that project-specific decision criteria and the basis on how you made the decisions. I realize that's a lot of concepts quite quickly and like heavy economic concepts. I'm hoping to just leave a flavor and happy to answer more detailed questions at any point. But for now, just to pause here, is there any high-level questions that relate to how you can use different cost-benefit analysis techniques to help you make a decision? Okay, very close to the end of the day. I'm going to skip ahead through a bunch of charts that interesting, but just come to a project summary, and then I think we'll have somebody to wrap up the day here. So we walked through one example. Over the course of the week, we may come back to the second example, or we may dig into some more detail, but I really appreciated all of the engagement. To talk specifically about this one, I animated this in a way that's going to be tricky with the board of, pardon me, but Highway 1, it was important for us to look at because it's a critical corridor for this road. It's got a history of steep creek hazards, floods, and debris flows that were disrupting activity on the road. And what we wanted to do was to inform the decisions around mitigation investments that would help them to maximize their return on investment so that they could use the limited resources available as effectively as possible. In order to do that, we first looked at, sorry, this is cutting in and out, but looked at the baseline risk. And what we learned there was that road closures and the most frequent events were driving the risk. That helped us to think about where did we want to target mitigation. We made conceptual level designs that helped us to do that cost-benefit analysis. And that's really important. You don't want to get so far in your design before you start evaluating it. You want to do enough, help you make the decision and figure out where to do more design work. And we developed criteria to prioritize future investment that were that would also enable, you could compare on some of the other pieces. You might want to compare on safety costs. It might be that you decide in the future you want to target your mitigation to reducing safety. So it's nice to have that flexibility. There were a bunch of key lessons here that we took away. They're not as clean as the key messages that Alex had, but they're more things that myself and the team learned along the way that we hope you can take with you. So the first one, all the way back at the beginning of this session, you might recall I talked about the work that had already been done. It was very helpful to us, but that prioritization approach was more suited to a different type of problem. Here we needed to use what's most cost effective. The next thing that was really important was that the methods used to assess risk had the right level of effort for the decision, that we picked consequences types that were relevant to the decision, and enabled us to be able to consistently compare between sites. We learned that when you go through the process of figuring out what's driving risk, it can really help you to decide how you're going to target your risk reduction approaches. That integrating costs over a service life, so both the capital and the O&M costs, actually gives you a better chance of representing what the true costs of the mitigation are. We learned how critically important it is actually to document the project-specific decision criteria, both for the experience of the team members. You get a lot of value out of documenting it internally because it forces you to clarify your thinking and figure out where there's maybe some gaps, and because it then helps it to communicate it to others. And then a key learning, we didn't get into this one here, but one of the learnings was that benefit-cost ratio can be really powerful, but in some cases, if you can only achieve a little bit of risk reduction, it can appear that you have an excellent option, but if a lot of risk is still remaining, then life cycle costs can be a tool to help with that. I'm going to touch on a couple of non-project specific ones. So the first is, when a project seems overwhelming, just start. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be start at the beginning, but start somewhere. Start kind of working to document, try to break down the problem. You can pick the pieces of the problem that you can feel most accessible to. And what you'll find is that you can build up to that complexity. Using the risk equation and putting numbers down can be incredibly powerful to be able to figure out, hey, what do I not know? So if you're at a spot where you find, I don't know how to assign a number to this, it helps you to think about what would I need to know to be able to assign a number, and then you can think about, should I go get that information? It's really, really powerful to force yourself to put the numbers down and to come up with numbers. And then the last thing is, when you're working on many sites, do your best to carry your analysis all the way through for at least one site. Because what you can do is, if you're trying to approach 40 sites at once, if you don't figure out that you've got a problem 3/4 of the way through your analysis, you've got 40 creeks that you have to solve the problem with. So if you can carry one all the way through, it can help you set you up for the other 39. So we started out at the beginning saying, that in mountainous environments, linear infrastructure will cross hazardous terrain. So the hazard-free options, they probably don't exist. And so what we are already trying to do is to use the available resources I've highlighted here effectively to manage risk, and to be able to do it incrementally over time. Prioritization is a tool. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. Hopefully over the course of the 3 days, you'll feel as though you're getting more and more of these tools to help you. And where it really helps you here is to support making decisions and to be able to guide investment in available resources. I've reiterated some of the same points here. I realize they're quite small, I've just gone through them. But I also wanted to leave you this, and thanks to K-Shub. K-Shub's put together some resources that are available on road engineering specific for Nepal. So when this gets circulated, please do refer to these resources. If you're looking for, they've got more of kind of an engineering focus. The focus today, we didn't have so much on the actual engineering design and more about the higher level approach, but these are available to you.